The quantum field collapsed at 11:47 p.m. David Holt didn't notice at first. His eyes were burning from 16 straight hours staring at entanglement patterns, and the lab's fluorescent lights had developed a migraine-inducing flicker somewhere around hour 14. He reached for his coffee, found it cold, was considering whether to brew another pot when the monitor chirped. Not an error, not a completion alert, something else. On the screen, where quantum probability clouds should have been dancing in their eternal uncertainty, a string of numbers had appeared: 42.36, 49 degree N, 71.05, 89 degree W. Below them, a date, November 15th, 1892. David rubbed his eyes. The numbers remained. He ran a diagnostic no external breach, no hack, no interference. The signal had emerged from within the quantum field itself, as if the universe had momentarily forgotten to be random and spelled out a message in the foam. He should have gone home. Rachel had called 3 times today. He'd let them all go to voicemail, the way he'd been doing for 6 months now, since the papers were signed. The coordinates pointed to a location 40 minutes north, somewhere in the Middlesex Fells. Going there at midnight based on a quantum glitch was exactly the kind of behavior that had made Rachel use words like obsessive and emotionally unavailable during their last counseling session. David copied the coordinates and grabbed his jacket. The drive through Boston's empty suburbs gave him time to construct reasonable explanations. Equipment malfunction, prank by a grad student, his own exhaustion manifesting as hallucination. By the time he reached the forest parking area, he'd almost convinced himself to turn around. Almost. The GPS led him down a trail that hadn't been maintained in decades. Spring frost crunched under his feet. His phone's flashlight carved a narrow tunnel through the pines until he reached the exact coordinates, an unremarkable spot between 2 oak trees, their branches still winter bare against the stars. He nearly missed it. A slight depression in the earth, too regular to be natural. David knelt, brushing away layers of decomposed leaves until his fingers hit metal. His pulse quickened. He returned to his car for the emergency shovel from his trunk. Rachel had insisted on the winter safety kit, back when she still cared whether he made it home. 20 minutes of digging revealed a metal capsule the size of a shoebox. The craftsmanship was Victorian in aesthetic, but impossibly precise joints, sealed with microscopic perfection, surface unmarred by 13 decades of burial. The lock mechanism opened at his touch, as if it had been waiting. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that crumbled at his fingers, lay a leather journal. David's flashlight trembled as he opened to the first page. His breath stopped. The handwriting was his own. March 1st, 2025. Rachel called today. I didn't answer. I should have answered. His phone showed March 14th, 2025. This entry described yesterday. Described the call he'd ignored. The voicemail he'd deleted without listening. Private details no one could know, but the journal's leather was aged, its pages brown with time. This wasn't a prank. This was impossible. Back in his lab, David ran every test he could think of. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the paper's age, 133 years, plus or minus 3. Spectral analysis of the ink matched Victorian-era iron gall formula. The leather binding showed cellular degradation consistent with the dated time frame. Every scientific instrument he possessed screamed the same impossible truth. This journal had been written in his handwriting and buried in 1892. He read through the night. The entries spanned from March 2025 to December 2157. They contained passwords he'd never shared, conversations he'd had alone in his car, thoughts he'd never voiced. Between personal entries were technical schematics, blueprints for something called the anchor, a device based on principles of quantum entanglement he recognized, but applications he'd never imagined. The progression of entries painted a life he hadn't lived. Reconciliation with Rachel, a daughter born in 2027, breakthrough research in 2051, Rachel's death in 2089, decades more of existence stretching into a future he couldn't imagine. Each entry was dated, specific, intimate, and written in handwriting that aged with its author. from his current precise script to an elderly shakiness by 2150. At 6 a.m., David reached the final entry. March 14th, 2157. The anchor is ready. I understand now what I didn't in 2025. Time isn't a river, it's a loop, and consciousness is the thread that stitches it closed. By the time you read this, the merge will have already begun. You'll think you have a choice. You do. You'll make the same choice I made, not because you must, but because you will. The capsule will be found on March 15th, 2025, at 12:03 a.m. You have 6 hours to understand what I took 132 years to learn. We are all ready. The entry stopped mid-sentence. David checked his phone. March 15th, 2025, 12:03 a.m. His hands shook as he flipped through the technical schematics again. The anchor wasn't just a machine, it was a bridge, a way to transmit quantum information through time by exploiting consciousness as a stabilizing force. The blueprints were complete, comprehensive, and used materials he had in the lab. The rational response was to walk away, burn the journal, pretend this never happened. David had built his career on empirical skepticism, on requiring extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims. But the evidence was here, in his own handwriting, describing events that hadn't happened yet with perfect accuracy about events that already had. By 2 a.m., he'd cleared his workbench. By 3 a.m., he'd gathered the components quantum processors he'd been using for his entanglement experiments, electromagnetic field generators, a crystalline matrix array he'd developed for his dissertation. The journal's instructions were precise, written by someone who knew exactly what materials David Holt would have available in his lab on March 15th, 2025. He should have been terrified. Instead, he felt the electric thrill of discovery, the same sensation that had driven him through graduate school, through breakthrough after breakthrough, through the collapse of his marriage. Rachel had been right. He was obsessed, but for the first time, his obsession had led him to something that transcended normal science. The anchor took shape under his hands, a cylindrical device the size of a coffee maker, covered in quantum sensors and field manipulation nodes. The core was a sphere of synthetic diamond he'd been using to study quantum decoherence. According to the journal, it would serve as a focal point for consciousness transmission. David worked in a fugue state, his hands moving with practiced precision through procedures he'd never performed. Part of him wondered if muscle memory could travel through time, if his future self was already guiding his movements. The thought should have been disturbing. Instead, it felt like coming home. At 7:27 a.m., he connected the final component. The anchor hummed to life, its quantum field stabilizing into a configuration his instruments had never recorded. The lab's lights dimmed as it drew power, and his computer screens flickered with interference patterns that looked almost organic. David sat back, exhaustion crashing over him. 3 days without real sleep. A marriage ended. A career built on rational skepticism shattered by a message from his future self. And now, a device that shouldn't exist, humming with possibilities he was only beginning to understand. He opened the journal again, reading more carefully. The technical notes between personal entries revealed the true nature of the anchor. It wasn't enough to send information through time. Quantum states collapsed without conscious observation to stabilize them. The device needed more than hardware. It needed a mind threaded through 132 years, existing simultaneously at both ends of the temporal loop. The headache started at 8:14 a.m. It wasn't pain exactly, more like pressure, as if his skull had become too small for its contents. David gripped the edge of the workbench as the sensation intensified, spreading from his temples through his neural pathways, like water finding cracks in stone. The first memory that wasn't his arrived at 8:17 a.m. Hannah's graduation, Yale University, May 2043. Pride swelling in his chest as his daughter, the daughter he didn't have, walked across the stage. Rachel beside him, her hair silver now, her hand finding his after years of learned comfort. The memory was vivid, complete, carrying emotional weight that made his eyes water. But Rachel had left him. They had no children. This hadn't happened. Not yet. David stumbled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. In the mirror, his eyes looked wrong. Not different in color or shape, but in depth, as if they'd seen decades he hadn't lived. Another memory crashed through. Himself at 90, hands liver-spotted and trembling, making a final adjustment to the anchor. The same device that hummed in his lab right now, but refined through a lifetime of obsessive improvement. His phone rang. Rachel's ringtone. He'd never changed it. His hand moved to answer before his conscious mind could object. "Hello, Rachel," he said. "David." Her voice carried surprise. He hadn't answered her calls in months. "I wasn't expecting... Are you okay? You sound strange." "I'm..." Another memory. Rachel in a hospital bed. 2289. Her last words. "Promise me you'll finish it. Whatever you're building, whatever this has all been for. Promise me." "David?" Rachel repeated, concerned. "We're going to have a daughter," he heard himself say. "Hannah. Born September 15th, 2027. She'll have your eyes and my stubbornness. She'll study bioengineering at Yale and solve the protein folding problem in 2051. She'll cry at her wedding in 2054, and I'll pretend I'm not." Silence. Then Rachel said carefully, "David, you're scaring me. Have you been drinking?" "No." "Yes. I mean, not alcohol," he replied. He laughed, but it came out wrong. "I'm drinking time, Rachel. 132 years of it, flowing backward into a single morning." "I'm calling someone," she started. "March 18th, he said quickly. 3 days from now. You'll be at Cafe Nero at 2 p.m. grading papers. You'll order your usual large cappuccino, extra foam. I'll walk in, and you'll be surprised I remembered the place. We'll talk for 3 hours. You'll agree to dinner on the 20th. Chinese food, that place in Cambridge with the hand-pulled noodles. You'll tell me about your mother's diagnosis. I'll actually listen this time." "How could you possibly—" Rachel began. "Because I remember it. Because it's already happened. Because it will happen," David explained. The paradox made perfect sense, and no sense simultaneously. "I can't explain it properly. Not yet. But in 3 days, when I walk into that cafe, you'll know I'm telling the truth." She hung up. Of course she did. In the memory that was flooding through him, she'd hung up too. Everything was happening exactly as it had happened. Would happen. Was happening now. David collapsed into his desk chair as more memories cascaded through. Not a flood anymore. An ocean. His daughter's first words. Technologies that wouldn't be invented for decades. His own death, chosen deliberately in 2157, not from age, but from decision. To complete the loop. To send his consciousness back. To become the anchor that held time in place. He understood now what his future self had discovered. The universe allowed paradoxes, but only stable ones. The loop had to be perfect, self-creating, with no external cause. David would live exactly 132 years making every choice that led to this moment. Not because fate demanded it, but because those were the choices David Holt would always make, given perfect knowledge of their outcomes. Free will and determinism collapsed into a single point, like a quantum particle observed. The merge accelerated, 2 timelines averaging into one consciousness. David experienced his life in superposition, memory, and prediction indistinguishable. He saw himself building the anchor twice, once in 2025 with 3 days of sleepless confusion, once through decades of careful refinement. The device in his lab was both prototype and perfected version, depending on which timeline he focused on. His lab partner, Marcus, arrived at 9 a.m. to find David on the floor, convulsing. "Jesus Christ! David!" Marcus called 911 while trying to keep David from swallowing his tongue. But David wasn't having a seizure. He was experiencing temporal compression, 132 years of existence forcing themselves through a single morning's worth of neurons. The paramedics stabilized him. The hospital ran tests. MRI, CT, EEG, all normal, except for unusual patterns in his hippocampus, the brain's memory center. The neurologist mentioned something about temporal lobe epilepsy, stress-induced hallucinations. David didn't correct her. How could he explain that his temporal lobe was processing actual temporal displacement? They kept him for observation. 3 days, exactly as he remembered, would remember, was remembering now. Rachel visited on day 2, not out of love, but concern. Marcus had called her, worried about David's mental state. "You were right about the cafe," she said quietly, sitting in the visitor's chair. "I don't understand how, but you were right. I hadn't even decided to go there yet." David looked at her, seeing simultaneously the woman who'd divorced him 6 months ago and the woman who'd share his bed for 64 more years. "I know this sounds impossible, but I need you to listen. Really listen, the way I should have during our marriage." He told her everything. The journal, the anchor, the temporal loop. She listened with the patient skepticism of a scientist Rachel taught molecular biology at MIT. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Show me," she said finally. They discharged him that afternoon. Rachel drove him to his lab, where the anchor still hummed its impossible frequency. David handed her the journal, watched her face pale as she recognized his handwriting, saw her hands tremble as she read entries about their reconciliation, their daughter, their life together that hadn't happened yet. "This is either the most elaborate delusion in history," she said slowly, "or you've broken physics." "Both," David replied. "The delusion is real. Physics was always broken. We just didn't know it." He showed her the anchor's readings, the quantum field configuration that shouldn't exist. He predicted with perfect accuracy a phone call she'd receive from her sister in 12 minutes. He described the conversation word for word. When it happened exactly as he'd said, Rachel sat down heavily. "If this is real," she whispered, "if you really know the future, our future, then you know how I die." 2089, David said softly. April 3rd. Pancreatic cancer, caught too late. You face it with more grace than I deserve to witness. Your last words are about the anchor, about making sure I finish it. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "Do we at least get good years before then?" "The best," David promised, remembering, knowing, living them all at once. 64 years of the kind of marriage we should have had the first time. We learn to listen, to be present, to choose each other every day, even knowing how it ends. "Especially knowing how it ends," Rachel corrected. And David remembered she'd say exactly that, had said it, would always say it. They went to dinner that night. Chinese food, the place with hand-pulled noodles. David knew every word they'd exchange, but that didn't diminish the experience. If anything, the foreknowledge intensified it. He could appreciate each moment fully, without anxiety about outcomes, without wondering if he was saying the right thing. He knew he was. He would. He always had. The complete integration happened over months, though David experienced it as a single eternal moment. Each day, he woke knowing exactly what would occur, yet still had to choose to live it. The paradox should have driven him mad. Instead, it brought a strange peace. He returned to work, continued his research, published papers that would lead to breakthroughs he already remembered making. His colleagues noticed a change. David had always been brilliant but erratic, prone to obsessive tangents. Now he worked with methodical precision, as if following a roadmap only he could see. Because he was. Rachel moved back in during the summer of 2025. Not rushed, not desperate, deliberate. They dated again, properly this time, even though David knew every restaurant they'd visit, every conversation they'd have. The knowledge didn't diminish the experience. A symphony wasn't ruined by knowing the notes. "Does it bother you?" Rachel asked one evening in September. "Knowing everything that will happen?" They were sitting on their back porch. Their porch again, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of temporal inevitability. "I know the sun will set," David replied. "Does that make it less beautiful?" "The sun doesn't have consciousness. It doesn't choose to set," she pointed out. "Neither do I, in a sense. I'll make every choice that leads to the anchor, to the loop, to this moment happening again 132 years from now. But they're still my choices. I'm not being controlled by fate, I'm creating it." Rachel studied him. "So you know about..." She touched her stomach. Hannah, David confirmed. Conceived last Tuesday. You haven't taken the test yet, but you will tomorrow morning. Positive. You'll cry in the bathroom for 12 minutes, happy tears, before coming to tell me. And you'll act surprised? She asked. No. I'll cry too. Because knowing it's coming doesn't make it less miraculous, he said, taking her hand. Every moment of her life is already in my memory. First word, light. 16 months old. First day of school, she'll insist on wearing her dinosaur backpack backward. Age 12, she'll ask why we named her Hannah, and you'll tell her it means grace. Age 23, she'll call us from Yale at 2 a.m., crying about a failed experiment, and I'll tell her that failure is just discovery wearing a disguise. Rachel's fingers tightened around his. How do you bear it? Knowing when we die? The same way everyone bears it, by living anyway. I just have more specific information. The pregnancy progressed exactly as remembered. David attended every appointment, held Rachel's hair during morning sickness, felt Hannah kick for the first time, even though he already knew the precise moment it would happen. His dual consciousness had stabilized, now past and future existing simultaneously, experience and memory indistinguishable. Hannah was born during a thunderstorm, just as he remembered. The nurse placed her in his arms, and David looked into eyes that would someday solve humanity's greatest biological mysteries. But right now, she was just his daughter, perfect and present, yawning with a whole life ahead that he'd already witnessed. The years folded into themselves. David watched Hannah take her first steps while remembering her last. He taught her to ride a bike in 2032, the same sunny Saturday he'd always taught her, would always teach her. Each birthday party, each school play, each bedtime story, all of it sacred in its inevitability. His research accelerated. Knowing the outcomes didn't exempt him from the work, but it eliminated dead ends. His 2051 breakthrough in quantum consciousness came exactly on schedule, built on decades of careful preparation. The Nobel Committee would call on October 4, 2052 at 3:47 p.m. David would be in his garden, planting tulips for a spring he'd never see, except he'd already seen it, 105 years ago, which was also 27 years from now. Time became a fluid medium he moved through rather than a fixed sequence he experienced. Rachel aged gracefully as he knew she would. Her silver hair came in gradually, a few strands at first in her late 40s, then spreading like wisdom made visible. They renewed their vows on their 25th anniversary, technically their 31st, counting the first marriage. But David didn't correct the math. Some truths were meant to be felt rather than calculated. "Do you still love me?" Rachel asked on her 70th birthday. "Or do you love the memory of loving me?" "There's no difference," David said. "Love exists outside time. It's the only thing that does." She died on April 3, 2089, at 6:47 p.m. David held her hand, whispered the words he'd always whispered, would always whisper. Her last breath was exactly as he remembered, and remembering didn't diminish the grief. If anything, it doubled it. He mourned her loss, and the anticipation of losing her, experienced and re-experienced, an endless loop of love and sorrow. Hannah spoke at the funeral. David knew every word, but still cried at the right moments, because they were the moments that deserved tears. The final years were solitary, but not lonely. David refined the anchor, each improvement bringing it closer to the device that would send his consciousness back. He understood now why the journal ended on March 15, 2157. After that date, both versions of himself would exist simultaneously, no need to document what both already knew. His body aged, but his mind remained sharp, suspended between two temporal states. He published his final paper in 2156, laying the theoretical groundwork for discoveries that wouldn't be understood for decades. The scientific community thought he'd gone senile, proposing consciousness as a fundamental force like gravity or electromagnetism. They wouldn't understand until after the loop closed, and by then, understanding wouldn't matter. On March 14, 2157, David made his final preparations. The anchor was complete, not the prototype from 2025, but the perfected version, refined through 132 years of obsessive improvement. He'd sent letters to Hannah, to colleagues, to the few friends still living. None mentioned the anchor. Some secrets were meant to be kept eternally. He sat at the same desk where he'd written the journal, where he was writing the journal, where he would always write the journal. The entries flowed from memory, experience, prophecy. His aged hands recording words that his younger self would read, had read, was reading right now in 2025. At 11:47 p.m., David activated the anchor for the last time. The quantum field responded instantly, recognizing the consciousness that had shaped it for over a century. David felt himself stretching, not through space but through time, his awareness spreading across 132 years, like light through a prism. He was 28 and 160 simultaneously, grieving Rachel and meeting her for the first time, holding infant Hannah and attending her funeral in 2111. The transmission wasn't painful. It was like stepping through a door he'd walked through countless times, would walk through countless times, was walking through right now. His consciousness compressed into quantum information, stable because it had always been stable, locked in an eternal loop of self-observation. He experienced 1892 from inside the capsule, not dead, not alive, suspended in quantum superposition, waiting for himself to find himself, to begin the cycle that had already begun, would always begin, was beginning now. David felt the earth settle around the capsule, felt roots grow and die above him, felt the slow transformation of forest to suburb to forest again, felt his younger self driving through the night, drawn by coordinates that emerged from quantum foam because consciousness demanded they emerge. The shovel bit into earth. His hands, younger lifted the capsule. The lock opened at his touch, as it always had, always would. Time collapsed. David existed in 3 states simultaneously. The young scientist discovering the journal, the old man transmitting his consciousness, and the quantum information suspended between them. Past, present, and future merged into a single eternal moment. He understood now what the anchor truly was. Not a device, but a choice. The choice to accept paradox, to become paradox, to exist as the thread that stitched time into a stable loop. Every human decision created tiny fractures in causality. David's decision healed them by accepting all outcomes simultaneously. Back in 2025, which was also now, was also then. David opened his eyes. The merge was complete. He was one person with 2 timelines, or perhaps 2 people with 1 timeline. The distinction no longer mattered. Marcus found him writing in a fresh journal. The first entry dated March 1st, 2025. Rachel called today. I didn't answer. I should have answered. You okay, man? You've been acting strange lately, Marcus said with concern. I'm perfect, David replied, and meant it. Everything is exactly as it should be. That evening, David went home to the house he shared with Rachel, would share with Rachel, had always shared with Rachel. She was grading papers at the kitchen table, red pen moving in familiar patterns. How was your day? She asked, not looking up. Eternal, David said. She laughed, thinking it was a joke about the tedium of academic life. But her hand found his across the table, an unconscious gesture of connection that would become conscious, deliberate, chosen every day for the next 64 years. David's phone buzzed. Text from Hannah, though she wouldn't be born for 2 years. Except there was no text. Just the phantom memory of texts that would come, had come, were coming continuously across decades of love. He stood, walked to the window. Outside, the universe continued its expansion, stars burning through their fuel supplies, galaxies spinning in their ancient dances, everything changing, everything dying, everything being born, except David Holt. He was the anchor now, the fixed point that held time in place, the conscious observer who collapsed quantum uncertainty into inevitable truth. He would live exactly 132 years, die exactly as planned, send his consciousness exactly where it needed to go. Not because he had to, because he chose to, would choose to, was choosing to right now in every moment, forever. Rachel called from the kitchen. "David, you coming to bed?" "Yes," he answered. "I'm on my way. I'll always be on my way." He turned from the window and walked toward his wife, carrying eternity in his skull, each step both memory and prophecy, each breath both first and last. The journal sat on his desk, waiting to be written. The anchor hummed in his lab, waiting to be built and rebuilt and built again. Time was a loop, consciousness was the thread, and David Holt was the needle that wove them together. Forever and ever. World without end. Amen. He smiled, his first genuine smile in years, though he'd already smiled it, would smile it always. The universe hummed around him, indifferent to paradox. But David wasn't indifferent. David was home.